The room smelled like boiled mint and lamp oil, and every time I swallowed, it felt as if I had a strip of sandpaper caught in my throat. I remember staring at the little crack of light beneath our bedroom door and listening to my husband unbutton his work shirt behind me. I had been sick since before breakfast. By supper, I could barely keep broth down, and when I told him I needed to sleep alone that night, he went very still. Then he said one word that hurt more than I expected. Defiance. I had heard that word used for stubborn children, for young people who ignored their parents, for someone who knowingly turned away from what they believed was right. I had never heard it used for a wife with a fever. And that night, lying under 2 quilts and shivering anyway, I began to wonder where obedience ended and simple human kindness was supposed to begin. My name is Katie. I am an adult Amish woman, and I share these stories because the small moments inside a home can tell you more than the big things outsiders usually notice. You can look at a plain dress, a horse and buggy, a kerosene lamp, and think you understand the shape of a life. But the harder questions are often quieter than that. They happen in kitchens after the dishes are put away, in bedrooms when nobody else can hear, and in the space between what you were taught and what your own conscience is telling you. If you have ever been made to feel guilty for needing rest, care, or simply a little space, I would be interested to know whether you spoke up right away or whether it took you time. That morning had started before 5. It was late winter, one of those gray days when the cold seems to settle into the wooden floors overnight. I knew something was wrong before I even sat up. My head felt heavy, my joints ached, and there was a dull pressure behind my eyes. I put my feet on the floor anyway. There were eggs to gather, bread dough to check, and laundry that had soaked overnight. In our house, sickness did not always mean you stopped. Sometimes it meant you did the work more slowly. By 6 o'clock, I had already dropped a spoon because my fingers were trembling. My husband noticed. He asked whether I had slept badly. I told him I felt feverish, but I also said I would be fine. That was partly habit and partly pride. I did not like making a fuss. I had watched my mother work through headaches, stomach sickness, pregnancy, grief, and winters, when everyone in the house seemed to have the same cough. She never turned suffering into a performance. I admired that about her, maybe too much. At breakfast, I managed half a piece of toast. My husband ate eggs and fried potatoes, then left for the shop behind his father's place. He told me to keep the stove warm because the wind was supposed to get worse. That was not unkind. At that point, he had no idea how sick I was going to become. Neither did I. Around 10, I carried a basket of laundry from the wash area toward the line and had to set it down in the snow. My knees simply stopped cooperating. I crouched there with one hand on the basket and watched my breath come out in short white clouds. The shirts inside the basket were already beginning to stiffen from the cold air. For a strange moment, I remember thinking that if someone came around the corner, I would be embarrassed to be found sitting there. That thought tells you something about me then. I was more worried about appearing weak than I was about being sick. I brought the basket back inside and left it by the door. Then I did something I almost never did in the middle of the day. I lay down. We had a narrow bed with a heavy wooden frame and a mattress that dipped slightly on my side. I pulled a quilt over my dress and slept for nearly 2 hours without taking off my shoes. When I woke, the room was warmer from the stove, but I was shaking so hard my teeth clicked. I found the thermometer we kept in a kitchen drawer. It was an old one, and I had to hold it under my tongue longer than I wanted to. The number was a little over 102 degrees. That changed the day for me. I stopped pretending I could work through it. I heated broth, I drank water, I put a damp cloth against my forehead. Around 4 in the afternoon, my mother came by because she had heard from my younger sister that I was ill. She brought a jar of canned peaches and a small paper packet of dried peppermint. She took one look at me and frowned. "You look like winter wrung you out," she said. That was my mother's way. Concern almost always came disguised as a practical observation. I told her I was embarrassed because almost nothing had been done. The laundry was still inside. The floor had not been swept. Supper was barely started. She touched the back of her hand to my forehead and said the one sentence I still remember from that day. A body is not disobedient because it needs rest. She did not say it dramatically. She said it while taking off her bonnet. Then she moved into my kitchen, as if she had already decided the argument. She finished the broth, put the peaches in a bowl, and folded the clothes that were dry enough to fold. She stayed less than an hour because she had her own household to tend. Before she left, she told me to get back into bed. I did. My husband came home a little after 6. His boots were wet, and there was sawdust stuck to the cuff of his trousers. He found me sitting at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug. He asked whether supper was ready. I said there was broth. He looked toward the stove, then toward the laundry basket by the door. I could see him taking in what had not been done. He did not complain immediately. He sat down, ate 2 bowls of broth, and asked how high my fever was. When I told him, he said I should have sent word. That sounds caring, and part of it was. But there was another part of our marriage then that I did not know how to name. My husband could be tender when he understood exactly what was expected of him. If I was visibly injured, he knew to help. If I was grieving, he knew to give me quiet. But when my need required him to change his own expectation, he could become rigid. After supper, he cleaned his bowl but left the rest of the dishes. I did not say anything. I was too tired to care. By 8, the fever had climbed again. I changed into my nightclothes and sat on the edge of the bed, dizzy enough that the floor seemed to tilt. My husband came in a few minutes later and began getting ready for bed. That was when I said, "I think I should sleep alone tonight." He looked at me in the mirror. I explained that I was coughing, sweating, and afraid he would get sick too. I also said I felt so miserable that I needed the space to turn over, get up for water, and sleep without worrying about waking him. He asked why I was making it into something bigger than it was. I told him I was not. He said we were married. I said I knew. Then he asked, "Are you refusing me?" Those words changed the feeling in the room. I want to be careful about how I tell this, because I am not interested in making every disagreement sound darker than it was. He did not shout. He did not threaten me. He did not touch me. The pressure came from somewhere quieter. It came from the way he framed my need as a moral problem. I told him, "I am sick. I need to sleep." He stared at me for a few seconds and said, "This feels like defiance." I remember looking down at my hands. There are moments when you expect yourself to have a powerful response, especially looking back years later. You imagine you should have stood up, said exactly what you believed, and drawn a clean boundary with perfect confidence. I did not. I started explaining myself again. I told him about the fever. I told him my chest hurt when I coughed. I told him I had slept for hours that afternoon and still felt exhausted. I reminded him that he had work the next day and would be better off in the spare room. The more I explained, the smaller I felt. That is one thing I understand now that I did not understand then. Sometimes over-explaining is what you do when you believe your own discomfort requires permission. He sat on the bed and listened. Then he said that a wife should not use illness as an excuse to pull away from her husband. That sentence stayed with me. Not because it was a rule I had been taught in exactly those words. It was not. And I do not want to pretend every Amish household thinks the same way, because they do not. Families differ, men differ, women differ, communities differ. What happened in my room belonged to my marriage, but I had grown up with a strong respect for duty. You finished what you started. You helped when help was needed. You did not build your life around personal comfort. You were careful about selfishness. Those ideas can make a person dependable. They can also be twisted if you are not careful. My husband had taken a good principle, faithfulness, and stretched it until there was almost no room left for compassion. I did not have those words yet. I only knew I felt ashamed for being sick. That was the part that disturbed me most. If he had simply been disappointed, I might have understood. Marriage contains disappointment. Two people do not always want the same thing at the same time, but calling it defiance made my fever sound like rebellion. It made rest sound like a failure of character. I finally said, "I am not trying to punish you." He answered, "Then do not act like you are." I felt tears come into my eyes, mostly from exhaustion. He saw them and looked away. For several minutes neither of us spoke. The lamp flame made a soft hiss. Wind pressed against the side of the house. Somewhere in the kitchen, A board in the floor cracked as it cooled. I remember every little sound because the room felt so still. Then I thought of my mother. A body is not disobedient because it needs rest. I heard the sentence almost exactly as she had said it. I stood up slowly, took my pillow, and walked toward the door. My husband asked where I was going. I said, "To sleep where I can sleep." That was not a dramatic declaration. My voice was weak and rough. I probably looked ridiculous carrying one pillow and a water glass while trying not to cough, but I went to the small spare room anyway. It had no stove of its own, so it was colder. I pulled 2 blankets over myself and lay curled on my side. I expected him to follow me and continue the argument. He did not. About half an hour later, I heard the bedroom door close. I cried then. Not because I thought my marriage was ending. I did not. Not because something terrible had happened in a physical sense. It had not. I cried because I had discovered a place where the two of us did not understand marriage the same way. To him, closeness and obedience had become tangled together. To me, for the first time, they were beginning to separate. I slept badly. I woke every hour or two, soaked in sweat, then cold again. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps in the hall. My husband opened the spare room door and set a cup of water on the little table. He did not apologize. He only said, "You are still warm." I told him I knew. He stood there for a moment, then asked if I needed anything else. I said no. He went back to bed. That small act made things more complicated, not less. People are rarely only one thing. My husband could be stubborn and caring in the same night. He could wound me with one sentence and bring me water a few hours later. If he had been cruel every minute, perhaps I would have understood the problem sooner. By morning, my fever was still high enough that he stayed home for the first half of the day. He fed the chickens and heated broth. He even carried the laundry basket away without mentioning it. But the argument had not disappeared. When I was well again, maybe 4 days later, I brought it up. That conversation happened at the kitchen table after supper. I remember because there was a loaf of bread between us, and I kept turning the bread knife so the handle lined up with the edge of the cutting board. I told him I could not accept being called defiant for being ill. He said he had been frustrated. I said frustration was not the same as truth. He frowned at that. I told him I had spent most of my life learning how to be useful, responsible, and obedient. I had no desire to become selfish, but if marriage meant I could never say, "I am too sick," without being accused of wrongdoing, then something was wrong with the way we were thinking about marriage. He asked whether I thought he had done something terrible. I said, "I think you made me feel guilty for having a body." That silenced him. It silenced me too, because I had not planned the sentence. I had simply said what was true. He leaned back and rubbed his hand over his face. Then he said he had not meant it that way. I told him I believed him, but intention was not the only thing that mattered. That was a difficult idea for both of us. In a close community, you are taught to pay attention to intention. Was someone trying to insult you? Was someone trying to harm you? Was someone acting out of pride? Those questions matter. But impact matters too. A person can hurt you while believing they are defending something good. My husband believed he was defending closeness in marriage. I believed I was defending the right to be cared for when I was sick. For a while, we sat there with those two truths between us. Eventually, he asked what I wanted him to have done differently. That question was the first sign the conversation might actually go somewhere. I told him I wanted him to believe me when I said I was unwell. I wanted him to stop treating every boundary as a rejection. I wanted us to be able to sleep in separate rooms for one night without turning it into a statement about the entire marriage. Then I said something else that was harder. I told him I needed the freedom to say no to closeness for reasons that belonged to my own body, without having to prove that my reason was serious enough. He looked uncomfortable. So did I. We were not used to talking that plainly, but sometimes plain speech is kinder than polite confusion. He did not suddenly become a different man after that conversation. Real life is not that neat. There were other moments when he became defensive. There were times I still apologized too quickly. There were times we both fell back into old habits, because habits are easier than wisdom. But the word defiance never sounded the same to me again. I began noticing how often women around me apologized for ordinary human limits. Sorry the baby kept me awake. Sorry my back hurts. Sorry I cannot lift that today. Sorry I am tired. Sorry I need help. We did not always say those exact words, but the feeling was there. A good woman was useful. A good wife was steady. A good daughter did not make her needs the center of the house. There is truth in humility. But humility is not pretending you have no limits. That distinction took me years to learn. When I think back to that winter night now, I do not remember it as the worst night of my marriage. It was not. I remember it as a revealing night. Illness stripped away all the extra things I normally use to keep peace. I could not work harder. I could not smile more. I could not make a nicer supper and wait for tension to pass. I was simply sick. And because I had nothing left to offer except the truth became very clear. I needed rest. My husband wanted reassurance. Those two needs did not have to be enemies. The mistake was believing one of us had to surrender completely for the other to be loved. That is the lesson I carry now. Marriage can ask a great deal of you. Faith can ask a great deal of you. Family can ask a great deal of you. Love itself asks for patience, sacrifice, forgiveness, and sometimes doing things when you would rather not. But love that is worth trusting also knows how to recognize a limit. A fever is not rebellion. Exhaustion is not disrespect. A person asking for space is not automatically rejecting you. And if someone you love says, "I cannot tonight," your first job is not to search for disobedience in the sentence. Your first job is to listen. I still think about my mother walking into my kitchen that afternoon, taking off her bonnet and telling me that a body is not disobedient because it needs rest. At the time, I thought she was talking about chores. Years later, I realized she had given me language for much more than that. If these stories help you see Amish life as something more complicated and human than the picture people usually have in their minds, you can subscribe and stay with me. I will keep telling you what daily life looked like from inside it, including the parts that were warm, the parts that were difficult, and the parts I did not understand until much later. And I would like to ask you one thing in the comments. Have you ever had to explain to someone you loved that needing rest or space was not the same as rejecting them?